to talk to you about holding yarn double. You may have seen this, you may have seen someone doing this, you may have seen it called for in a pattern, and you might be wondering, why? Why would I be doing this? Why wouldn't I just get the correct yarn and the correct weight and do that? But there are a lot of different reasons that you might be holding yarn double for certain kinds of patterns. So I thought it would be helpful today to talk about why you may or may not want to hold yarn double, and then how to go about holding yarn double for a successful project. We're also going to be talking about mohair or Surrey lace weight, which in the last few years we've seen being held double with projects a lot, and whether that's absolutely necessary. And then I will wrap up with giving you just a few tips for working with your yarns held double. So if that sounds like it might answer some questions for you, I hope you will stick around. All right, so why would we be holding yarn double? Yarn comes in various weights, so there's really not a need to combine to get the weight you need. So what on earth is the point? The probably most prominent reason you might hold yarn double is because the pattern tells you to. And that is not to say that you always have to follow patterns to a T, but if the pattern is specifically calling for yarn held double, and you want your thing, whatever it is, to turn out like the pattern, probably you want to do that too. Especially if you are a newer knitter and don't have as much experience with how yarns knit up, what kind of fabric they create. When in doubt, you're going to want to follow the pattern. So in a minute, I'll talk about, okay, the pattern says so, but why does the pattern say so? But first, number one, the pattern says so. Number two is that you don't have the right weight yarn for the pattern, but you have some other yarn. So maybe you want to knit a hat, but you don't have 200 yards of an Aran weight yarn, but you do have 400 yards of a DK weight yarn. In that case, instead of buying new yarn, you can still do some stash diving, use up some of the yarn that you have. And we'll talk a little bit later about what you hold with what to make what weight yarn. But this can be a good way to use up yarn that you have without making unnecessary purchases and still get the patterns that you want. So those are the two big things. The pattern says so, or you don't have the right weight yarn. But there are a couple of others, and this gets into more, why does the pattern say so? But you can also make this choice on your own, especially when you become a more experienced knitter. One is that holding yarns of different colors together can give you a new kind of interesting looking marling effect. I have just started a new project. It is a hat hood for my husband for our anniversary, which today is Wednesday and it's Tuesday, so I'm way ahead of the game, of course. And the pattern calls for 3 yarns held together. It calls for an Aran weight yarn and then 2 strands of a lace weight yarn. Why does it call for that? Could be a lot of different reasons, but the interesting thing is that I'm getting a nice marling effect by holding 2 different color yarns together. So I am holding 1 strand of Durham Natura Gilead in a color whose name I can't remember. That, and then I am holding 2 strands of this, which is a lace weight Surrey mohair silk from Amano Yarns, and they are this color. And then when we put them together, we get this. It looks, kind of from a distance, just looks like a pale blue. But when we get up close, you can see that marling effect in there. Come on, there we go. So some designers are going to be using sort of that marling as kind of an element of their pattern, especially in the case where they've got one solid color and then they're, if it's color work, it's a mosaic knit, whatever the case may be. Your other color, if you're holding 2 strands of yarn together, you're going to get kind of that marled, variegated effect. And that might be part of the pattern. So that marling that you get might be one of the reasons that you're holding yarn double. The other reason is that you want to get some properties of both yarns in your garment. So as another example, this is also holding 3 strands together. This is my almost finished Amelie cardigan that I am running out of yarn for on the last sleeve. And this holds 3 strands of a lace weight yarn together. So if you were to knit a sweater out of a single strand of lace weight yarn at an open gauge, it would just simply be too delicate. But if you were to use, now if you hold 3 strands of lace weight together, that's probably something like a sport weight. Maybe, yeah, kind of maybe even still a fingering weight, a heavy fingering. If you were to just use that, you wouldn't get all of this same drape that you're getting by using the lace weight yarn. It would most likely create a denser, heavier fabric. And the yarn I am using for this is, I believe the pattern actually called for 3 strands of a fuzzy yarn, a mohair silk. I am actually using, or maybe it did 1 and 3, whatever. So what I'm using is 1 strand of a silky, fuzzy, whatever, this is a Surrey silk, I think, and then 2 strands of a lace weight alpaca. So I'm holding these 3 together. So I'm getting some fuzz, I'm getting some marling from the distinct colors, I'm getting lots of drape from the lace weight yarn. So it just happens that sometimes a single yarn simply doesn't have all the properties that you want, or it doesn't have all the properties that the designer wants, but by holding things double, you can get them all mixed together just the way you want and create the fabric that you or the designer had in mind. And then the last one I just kind of touched on a little bit is adding strength. So especially with that, that Surrey silk or the mohair silk, the silk element and the mohair as well a little bit, they're very strong, and adding them into other less sturdy yarns can actually add some durability in there. At the same time, even though they're very strong, if you try to knit, you know, a whole sweater with a single strand of that Surrey silk, in order to get it to make a structured garment, you would have to knit so tightly because it's so fine. So instead you can combine it with something else and get more strength into your garment while also, you know, getting those properties, the fluffiness and the drapiness. So ultimately, unless it's because you don't have the right weight yarn, most of the time that you are holding yarns double, it is because there is some combination of properties that you want in your finished garment that you can't get from a single strand of yarn. So whether that's drape or strength or the marl colors, whatever it may be, it's simply not available with just 1 strand of yarn. But we're all so creative, knitters and designers, that we said, hey, we'll grab some of this, some of that, we'll put them together, and voila, we'll get exactly what we want, even though it's not available in just 1 yarn. All right, so those are the basic whys of why you might be doing this. How do you go about doing it? So, of course, if the pattern tells you to do it and tells you how to do it, then you don't have to worry about that. If it says get this kind of yarn and this kind of yarn, you just do that. And you don't have to put too much more. Now I've got all the alpaca and mohair in my nose. You don't have to put a whole lot of thought into it beyond that, if the designer is intending for you to hold 2 yarns together. But let's just say they're not, or just haven't done it before, you want to do it on your own. How are we going to do it? So the first thing is, and even if, you know, the designer is calling for you to hold 2 yarns double, maybe you don't have those 2 particular yarns available to you. So you still need to make some adjustments. The first thing you want to do is whatever the weight of the yarn in the pattern, whether you are using 2 strands where the pattern uses 1, or you're using 2 strands but the pattern uses 2 different strands, you want to try to match the weight and the gauge that are given in the pattern. That is going to give you the finished garment that comes out with the right kind of fabric and the right size, obviously, always very important. You also probably want to try to match the fiber content closely. You don't have to be exact, you know, but if what they're having you hold double incorporates some silk and some alpaca or some mohair and some merino wool, those different fibers all have distinct properties, and you kind of probably want to land somewhere in that range as well. It doesn't have to be exact, but if they've got all of these different fibers that are probably working together to create this fabric, and you are using, you know, 100% cotton, well, your thing is going to look very different. And of course, you know, I have to say, even though everyone hates it, you absolutely have to swatch. So I was actually, I was going to swatch this before I started the video, but then I realized that the pattern that I'm doing, the first part of it is just to make a little square and then pick up a round. So I already had a square and I didn't really have to swatch. But that's because I was like, well, it's just so small. If I don't like it, I can rip it out. But you want to swatch to make sure, first of all, that you like the color. When you are combining colors, sometimes you just looking at them, you're like, oh, this is going to be great together. But once you put them together, not so much. Something about the way that you're holding them and knitting them up together, they just don't play as well together as you thought. So you want to be able to check the color. You definitely want to be checking that your gauge is on track. You want to make sure that you like the fabric. If you're holding, you know, and I'll do this a little bit, get into this a little bit more later, but if, you know, the pattern says you're going to hold 2 fingering weight yarns and you have 2 fingering weight yarns, but fingering weight yarn is kind of a subjective category with lots of wiggle room. Your 2 fingering weight yarns may make a very different fabric. It may be too dense. It may be not dense enough. Maybe your yarns are thinner or heavier. So you want to check that the fabric that you're getting is something that you like. If it's supposed to be dense, you want to make sure it's dense. If it's supposed to be light and drapey, you want to make sure it's light and drapey. So for the other project that I had with the 3 yarns held together, I tried it both ways. I tried it with 2 strands of the Surrey silk and 1 of the alpaca lace weight, and then I did the 2 alpaca and 1 strand of the Surrey silk, and that's what I landed on. But I tried it both ways because I wasn't sure what the fabric was going to look like. I knew I needed to use all 3 strands, but the balance of those, the 2 floofy strands, it was too floofy. I wasn't gonna like it that way. It was gonna be too floofy for me. So you wanna check that. Obviously you wanna check gauge. But whereas for a lot of patterns, you're maybe just swatching just to check gauge, there are a lot of other elements that you wanna check when you're holding your yarn double or triple that really, really super necessitate a swatch, even if you don't usually do it. Or at the very least, you know, starting with some small part of the project, the brim of the hat, you know, a sleeve cuff, something where you can double check that you like whatever it is before you get too involved in the project. Now, the actual physical act of holding yarn double. There are a couple ways to go about this. Personally, in my experience, I believe the best way is to have 2 separate balls of yarn, pulling 1 strand from each ball. However, you could also pull from both ends of a single ball of yarn. You could also wind up 2 strands of yarn together into a single cake. I feel like that has the potential to get very messy. I feel like maybe I tried it once. Once you have it wound up into that cake, then you don't have to worry about your yarns getting tangled as you're pulling from 2 balls or 2 ends of 1 ball. But The actual process of caking the two strands together can get really messy. Two strands from opposite ends of the ball, especially if you're using a really fine yarn, that can also get a little tangly and messy. So in my personal opinion, 2 balls of yarn, you can take a single skein of yarn and just cake it up into 2 separate balls. You know, just you have to weigh you can weigh your skein or whatever you have, whatever the shape is, so that you get half and you can separate it that way. Has the least potential for tangling in my personal opinion. So once you have decided your method, you are simply going to have 2 ends to get started on your project and hold them together and work with them as if they are a single strand of yarn. So in terms of the physical act of knitting, that is how you would do it. So you can see here, I've got all 3 balls in the bag, and I simply hold all 3 together as I'm working and work as if they are a single strand of yarn. So hold, and which side are we on? Okay, so just, and it for this yarn in particular, because I've got floofy yarn, they tend to stick together. And while that can create its own problems depending on what you're doing, it makes it easier to hold them as a single unit while you are working with them. Yeah, so I'm just going to act like I've got 1 strand of yarn, even though I have 3. In terms of the weight, there are guidelines, and I'm going to tell you what they are. But I want to add the caveat that because the different categories of yarn are so subjective, this is not 100% across the board accurate. And again, you should swatch to check. First of all, if you are holding your yarns double, but the pattern has a single yarn, you need twice as much yarn. That's why I said, you know, it's unlikely that you don't have enough yarn for a worsted weight sweater, but you do have enough DK weight yarn to hold double for a sweater. But for something like a hat or something like that, that is lower yardage, but you're going to need double. So 2 strands of lace weight is somewhere around a fingering or sport weight, depending, you know, again, how heavy the lace weight is. 2 strands of fingering is a DK weight. 2 strands of sport is a worsted. 2 strands of DK is an Aran, supposedly. And 2 strands of worsted is a bulky. So that's generally speaking how you're going to double up your yarn. But as I said, you know, you have people who will call something that's 100 grams, 375 yards of fingering weight, and something that's 100 grams, 450 yards of fingering weight. And that's a pretty big difference in the weight of those yarns. If you were to hold them together, you would get very different weight yarn doubled. So you definitely want to swatch. 2 strands of DK is an Aran. You know, I've seen in the past people saying 2 strands of DK is a worsted. Absolutely not. Unless it's a very, very light DK. 2 strands of DK is at best an Aran, and it's may even be getting a little bit beyond that. So if you do need a worsted weight yarn, you're going to want to use a sport, and there's just so much less sport weight yarn out there. But those are the general guidelines for holding your yarns double. I will include a link to this little cheat sheet that I found online in the description box down below in case you want to check it out. But that's the general guideline. Always keeping in mind that, you know, the terms that we use for yarn weights are just very variable. And there's no rule. There's no like yarn police. You can you can call your yarn whatever you want. So you really want to keep an eye on, you know, the actual physical weight of the yarn, 50 grams, 100 grams, and the yardage or meterage to get a better idea of how to combine. Something I wanted to touch on a little bit is the thing that we've been doing for the past, maybe, is it 5 years even? Maybe not quite. Past few years in knitting, which is adding mohair to everything, which is adding a strand of mohair, silk, or Surrey silk to other yarns, which is fine if you like that. It's lovely. So the reason I think, we're seeing this is because it can incorporate some marling. It gives your sweater a nice fuzz, a little floof. And it has created a market for these yarns that, while beautiful, trying to knit with them by themselves, there's not a whole lot you can do with them. Because they're so fine, but also because they're so fluffy, they're not great for sort of intricate lace, because they obscure that pattern too much. Also, mohair and Surrey are both very warm, so they can add a little bit of extra warmth into your garments. So absolutely, it's lovely. Go for it if you like to do it and you think it looks nice and you like the extra warmth. It is almost always optional. First, I kind of want to pick a fight with, you'll see patterns out there that say, this is a worsted weight sweater, and then they tell you to combine a strand of fingering with a strand of mohair. That's not a worsted weight sweater. Not even close. If you combine a strand of the mohair silk with a worsted weight yarn, you're basically not changing the weight at all because it is so fine. Now, ultimately, again, these categories, fingering, DK, worsted, they don't matter as much as the fabric that you get and the gauge that you get. So you don't have to get too bogged down in the names. But when you're looking on Ravelry for a pattern and you're searching for worsted weight sweaters and you find one and you like it, but it turns out it's actually a fingering weight plus a strand of silk mohair, I think that is a little unfair to knitters, because that's not a worsted weight sweater. I mean, in general, it's just not. You can't really just substitute a worsted weight yarn, maybe a DK weight yarn, but not a worsted weight yarn. And most of the time, if people are saying, oh, I've got this worsted weight yarn, I want to make a worsted weight sweater, it's because they want to make a sweater with worsted weight yarn. They don't want to go buy a bunch of fingering weight yarn and silk mohair to create that. So that I have a little bit of an issue with. Again, if the sweater is already worsted weight and you're adding a strand of silk mohair, that's really not changing the gauge or the fabric a whole lot, and so you can probably just leave it out. Trying to do the same thing with the fingering weight, though, because the fingering weight is so much lighter, the impact there of the silk mohair is much greater, and you can't always just knit your fingering weight sweater without the silk mohair. So that's something to keep in mind. But overall, the most important thing is to check your gauge, make sure you like the fabric, make sure you like whatever marling is happening, and make sure that you are getting the correct gauge so that your thing comes out the correct size. But as I said, it's almost always optional to add that extra strand, especially with heavier weight sweaters. If it's already, a worsted or even a DK, taking out that strand of lace weight is not going to have that much of an impact. If it's a DK with a silk mohair, maybe you want to use a worsted instead. It really just becomes a little bit more of a problem with the fingering weight sweaters. And then the last thing I want to say is that while most patterns are talking about adding the lace weight mohair silk, which is very light and does not impact gauge a whole lot, the Surrey silk is floofier, and in my experience, that is going to substantially change your fabric if you leave it out. So you may need to, if you don't want to include it, you may need to substitute something else or use a heavier yarn. The alpaca is just a little bit denser than the mohair, and it also blooms more. It floofs up and fills in the space more. So that you can't always substitute one to one. So I definitely prefer the alpaca silk to the mohair silk, but you can't always just swap them out because the alpaca is a little bit heavier. And two, if you see a pattern that you like that has the alpaca silk and you want to leave it out, you have to keep an eye on your yarn because it's just a little bit heavier, a little bit denser. But it can be really nice, especially for people who, I personally find, I'm not allergic to mohair, it's fine, but I do find it a little more prickly, whereas the alpaca is not. And some people are allergic to mohair. So the Surrey alpaca silk can be a nice sub, but it's not a 1-for-1. So keep that in mind. Lastly, a few tips if you are holding your yarn double. First, make sure that you are double checking your yardage so that you are sure you have enough. So you basically need double whatever the pattern calls for, if the pattern is only calling for 1 strand and you are doubling up. Stop occasionally to untangle your yarns. So they tend to start twisting around each other. And 1, you don't want to get them to get tangled, but 2, if they start twisting around each other too much and you just keep knitting with them like that, it can start to look a little weird in your fabric. And it can start to cause your fabric to skew a little bit as well. So what I'm looking for is to bias, because they're twisting together and they're adding twist into your fabric. So just stop occasionally and, you know, unwind your yarns so that they're not bound up together, to avoid tangles and to avoid weirdness in your fabric. 3, check that gauge swatch for color fastness. So especially if you are going for like a marled effect between a light and a dark yarn, make sure you wash your swatch with wool wash, or you know, whatever the appropriate wash is for your fibers, to make sure that your darker color is not going to bleed into your lighter color. Unless you like the way that looks, and that's fine, that's an option. But maybe you don't, you want that kind of distinctive marling. You don't want things to bleed. Definitely wash your swatch and check for that. Use sharp needles so that as you are knitting, you are making sure that your needle tip is always going through all of the strands, especially, bad enough with 2, but if you are working with 3 strands held together, you really want to make sure that you are always getting your needle tip through all 3 strands. So if you're using really dull needles, that may not work. And especially if you are using, of course, the silk mohair or the Surrey silk, you need the needle tip to be sharp enough to get under those very thin strands. So make sure you have some nice quality needles. And then my last tip, if you are knitting with the silk mohair or the Surrey silk held double with another yarn, when you are casting on, leave it out. Just cast on with the heavier yarn and then add it in after you have finished the cast on. It just makes things a little bit easier to count your cast on stitches, make sure you have the right count. And especially if, you know, sometimes it is hard enough to frog things that are worked with mohair, but it is especially hard to undo cast on sometimes. And then if you add the mohair in there, that is even worse. You won't even be able to tell if you leave the mohair strand out when you do your cast on, and it will just make casting on, counting your stitches, and then hopefully not, but if necessary, make frogging a little bit easier if and when the time comes. So leave it by the side, grab it once you finish your cast on. No one will know. All right, so that is the ins and outs of holding yarn double while you are knitting. Why you might want to do it, how you should do it, and a few tips to make it a little bit easier for you. I hope you found this video interesting and useful. If you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. New knitting videos here every Saturday. If you're looking for me on social media, you can find me on Ravelry and Instagram as Media Peruana, and I will see you next time.